Hello, welcome to Wellness on Wednesdays at Studio Z. Today our creativity is catered by A Taste of Zion, custom catering by Tammy Lynn Fox. And our topic, our wellness series, continues with A Gut Feeling by Dr. Christy Taoka. Take it away, Dr. Christy.
So this is my most painful slide, and I apologize. I did practice on my husband, and he said, really, I'm glazing over. But two things. I think you can handle it, and two, it's a complex system, so there's only so much you can simplify before you start to lose some of the important information. All right, so we're going to go on that side first. So we're going to talk about the inflammation hypothesis of neuropsychiatric conditions, meaning your mood, primarily your mood, anxiety, depression, how will you handle stress, and then so again, there's a bidirectional signaling, but it's mediated through multiple ways and multiple systems, all right? So you have the vagus nerve, so there's neuronal input, which goes back and forth. So there's input from the brain down through the vagus nerve, and there's input from the gut through the vagus nerve back to the brain. There's endocrine signaling both ways, right? So the hormonal system signaling both ways. So things like leptin and ghrelin affect your satiety, they are produced by the gut and the GI system, and they are affected by, as well as your adipose tissue, and they affect your brain to figure out how satiated you are. And then the immune system is really actually affects both and interplays between the two. So what's interesting is so you have this is your intestinal lining. All right, single layer. These little cells are called enterocytes. They're all tightly together. They're joined by tight junctions. And on this side, it's like the food. This is where it's being digested, and it goes through, absorb the nutrients. But on this side, where it's absorbed into the circulatory system, and the circulatory system kind of can bring immune cells and responses to threats on this side. So, but just like there's tight junctions here and a barrier in your intestines, you have a blood-brain barrier, right? So that's supposed to help protect your nervous system. It does allow, there is some permeability for both, all right? You need some there's a normal level of permeability in your intestines and a normal level of permeability in your blood-brain barrier to allow nutrients through. And in the case of the intestines, to allow things like, there's an immune cell called a dendrite that comes on this side, extends its long little arms and goes out into the food side, sort of sample things, and that's actually how your immune system both primes itself and also develops tolerance to what should not be a threat, right? So there's a normal level of tight junction opening on both sides, but the problem is the increased or pathogenic level of permeability in the intestinal layer, and we'll go through how that happens. But what's interesting is your intestinal permeability seems to mirror your blood-brain barrier permeability. Okay, so the more leaky gut, it's called leaky. The term can be leaky gut. The more leaky gut you have, the more leaky, more susceptible you are for things that are going on in your body to affect your brain, or things that you're taking in that would not normally cross the blood-brain barrier to now get across the barrier and potentially cause issues. And it says about this SCFA, short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate, propionate, and acetate. And butyrate in particular is produced by our preferable microbiome, and they actually help feed your enterocytes. Right? So the microbiome are actually producing food to keep your enterocytes healthy and those tight junctions healthy. Right? So, but when it starts to shift and we don't have the short-chain fatty acid producing bacteria, we start to have less gut health. And those enterocytes are not as happy. They can't do the jobs they need to do. They can't maintain those tight junctions. So sometimes things start to get through. So things can get through. They're showing that bacteria can get through, but also just large proteins. So normally the big proteins don't get through. They get broken down over here, and then the small, just short chains of amino acids get through the cell. Right, the cell actively transports them through the membrane. So, but the problem is large proteins, if they do get through, and you start to have leaky junctions because the barrier is not maintained, those large proteins tend to be highly immunogenic. They tend to stimulate the immune system. So there's a lot of, there's a researcher, Alessia Fasano, at Harvard. He's the head of pediatric gastroenterology at the Celiac Institute at Harvard, and he actually has a good argument for particularly gluten sensitivity as a major precursor to the development of autoimmunity. Partly because you need the permeability and then the large protein like the gluten to get through, and the gluten can mimic a lot of human proteins, and then you get cross-reactivity. All right, so you get so the large protein gets through, it stimulates the immune system. The immune system, unfortunately, stimulates further gut intestinal permeability. But like Alessia Fasano says, the gut is not like Vegas. All right, what happens in the gut does not stay in the gut. The inflammation happening here not only goes back and negatively affects the gut, but it's actually affecting inflammation everywhere. So, and thereby affecting the inflammation at the blood-brain barrier, causing blood-brain barrier breakdown. So then you get neuronal inflammation, which feeds back and causes gut inflammation, and it's an unfortunate cycle, right? So again, gut health affects your hormones, and you can also, and over here, it's just showing that it affects even the breakdown, how you break down some of your amino acids like tryptophan, and you instead of producing serotonin and melatonin, which help you with your mood and your sleep, you end up producing a couple of these acids that are highly neuroinflammatory, right? So just an unfortunate cascade. So I realize it's a lot of information. Anybody have questions before I go on? Yes.
Is it reversible?
Yes. So, it is. There's a lot you can do about it. So the microbiome and mood. So we're talking about it's a gut feeling. But I do want to say that depression and anxiety, they're multifactorial, meaning there's lots of contributors and aspects. So I'm not saying necessarily that just changing your diet and taking some probiotics is going to necessarily fully shift you. But I think in conventional medicine, we have maybe not necessarily addressed or appreciated the heavy impact of those basic things on our mental health and brain health. Right? So like I said before, your gut microbiome can affect your how you produce serotonin, or basically if you're breaking tryptophan down to serotonin, or if you're breaking it down to neuroinflammatory compounds. They're actually finding that some antidepressants may be working through the gut microbiome. Okay, and it's unclear. There's theories out there that maybe that's why a lot of antidepressants cause weight gain. It's actually because it's how it's affecting the gut microbiome. That is not definitively proven. It's theory, but it makes sense. So with the microbiome, it's not just which gut bugs you have, but it's how many bugs you have that really matters. So they actually think diversity is the actually most important factor, and then the which is the predominant species, or which are the predominant species that matter. So we should have several hundreds of different species and strains in our guts, but that can base with how we eat. Like you've probably heard it called the SAD diet or the standard American diet. That can tend to influence our gut microbiome towards one that is not so helpful for our system. And then antibiotic exposure, chemical exposures like glyphosate, which you probably all heard of. It's in Roundup, and it's actually an antibiotic, believe it or not. And so it affects our microbiome. So diversity matters, and what they found was that these depressed patients had a lot less diversity in their microbiome. So now, these unfortunate little rats, but they did something really interesting. They took the fecal samples from the depressed patients and transplanted them into the GI tract of these healthy rats. So poor little rats. But what they found was interesting was these healthy rats that had been behaving with normal rat-like behavior started to express depressive and anxiety-like symptoms. So, like I said, there's a two-way access between the gut and the brain, and we're finding that the brain can influence the gut microbiota, but this is fairly strong evidence that the gut microbiome itself is enough to affect your brain quite significantly. So diets, again, we talked about standard American diet not being so helpful. So a strict Mediterranean diet, which are generally very high in in vegetables, fruits, healthy oils, fish, seafood, and very low in processed food. It's been shown to have about a 25% risk of developing depression. So there was a study in Japan that had very similar kind of composition. It's not a Mediterranean diet, it was a Japanese diet, but one that was low in rice, which is highly in Japanese. But low in rice and low in processed food, high in vegetables, high in fruits, high in seaweed and seafood. And again, they had very similar findings, lower risk of mental health issues. And again, that's part of it is because they're probably feeding their microbiome. All right, so your microbiome, the healthier microbiome, love fiber. So fiber is a very important part of the process. That the microbiome has a role in neurodegenerative diseases and like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So there's evidence that some of the beta amyloid that you get the plaques in the brain in Alzheimer's, and I also had the alpha synuclein, in Parkinson's disease, are actually produced in the gut. It's unclear if they actually travel directly up through the vagus nerve to the brain and deposit, and then cause neuroinflammation, causing further degeneration, or there's a new theory. It's called molecular mimicry, where basically it's kind of an odd theory, but there's mounting data that the protein unfolding down, the odd protein unfolding down here causes the same thing to happen on a chain-wise reaction all the way up. Either way, basically, it's happening in the gut, and the effects are getting to the brain, and it's causing neuroinflammation and degeneration. So the good news is, yes, so you can have these unfortunate downward cycles, but you can also kind of start to move it the other way, right? And so you can, by changing our diets to higher fiber, sort of gut healthier, so working on our stress, avoiding the foods that we're sensitive to that increase inflammation. So all those things can sort of start to turn the tide back the other way. We talk about the importance of the vagus nerve. So we talked about how it does intermediate between the brain and the gut. But vagus stimulation by itself seems to be very helpful for mood and probably gut health. And so it's a huge, long cranial nerve. It's the longest one in the body, and affects your heart, your circulatory system, endocrine system, immune system, your gut, obviously, and your respiratory system. So, and it can also mediate satiety and hunger signals. So if you have adequate vagal stimulation, you may not be as hungry all the time. All right. Inflammation, unfortunately, again, can dysregulate your vagus nerve as well, and so all those signals are not working as well. And the stimulating the vagus nerve may actually be anti-inflammatory. So they're starting to do some studies, and even in the ICU, about stimulating the vagus nerve, and that can help with a total body inflammatory state, potentially. There's early studies. So stress can affect the brain, which can affect the gut, which can affect how well you're dealing with stress in the brain, which can affect your gut. So one thing you can do to sort of stop that cycle is breathe. So breathing exercises, it stimulates the vagus nerve, and it helps kind of slow things down, and activates our parasympathetic nervous system, right? So simply, I'm going to do a breathing exercise. Anybody want to do one with me? Sure. So there's lots of breathing studies done. The hard part is they're not really well standardized. So they've done all kinds of breathing techniques, and so that's what's really hard to kind of do this coherent. This is what works best. But the most consistent finding that they have is that 6 breaths a minute is about the rate that seems to really work with stimulating that parasympathetic nervous system. So we're going to do 6 cycles, so 1 minute of breathing, 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, and we're going to see how we feel after that. If anybody gets lightheaded at any point, though, that can happen, please stop. Just go home